few days ago, we had the primary elections for the Maryland Senate contest, and we found out who the Democratic and Republican nominees were going to be formally. Now, pretty unsurprisingly, former Governor Larry Hogan became the Republican nominee, although he did have a contested primary, and the Democratic nominee who sort of rose out of the pretty ugly primary battle was former county executive of Prince George's County, Angela Alsobrooks. So we're going to talk about this Senate race and why I think the rating for this race is certainly going to change now that we have the nominees of either party, and now that we have some new polls that indicate that Larry Hogan is falling behind, which, as we're going to go on throughout the video, in the state of Maryland, shouldn't really be that surprising. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So in the primary elections that we had back on Tuesday, President Joe Biden got 87% of the vote. Donald Trump only got 78% of the vote in the Republican primary. Of course, you have sort of the uncommitted movement due to sort of the conflict going on in the Middle East and, among progressive voters. But by and large, Biden's performance in Maryland was decently strong, especially compared to some other states where the uncommitted movement has gained a lot more traction. But if we scroll down, of course, to the Senate primary, Larry Hogan ended up winning that with 63% of the vote and ended up only losing 4 counties around the state. Now, ideally for Hogan, he would have won by a much larger margin, being a former popular Republican governor, but Larry Hogan has had some massive issues with the Republican base, especially after his response to COVID back in 2020, being much more on the side of lockdowns and restrictions. And, even though he represented a blue state, many Republican voters never forgave Larry Hogan for doing that, and as a result, he's gotten a much colder reception from the base. But nonetheless, he still won this primary by a pretty convincing margin and moves on to the general election. The Democratic primary is what was pretty interesting because for the longest time, David Trone, who was the former representative of Congress for the western part of the state, was leading in the polls by a considerable amount. And then the Democratic establishment in the state basically coalesced around Alsobrooks, probably acknowledging that she's probably the stronger of the two candidates because David Trone has a lot of scandals tied to him that could certainly hurt him in a general election. Alsobrooks comes from a very, very blue part of the state, Prince George's County. Now, Alsobrooks being from the DC area is obviously very important as well because this was what gave her a pretty convincing primary win. Obviously, her being from Prince George's County, the most Democratic county in the entire state, gave her a massive advantage in this primary. And the margin of victory here is basically what essentially sealed the deal for her. Everywhere else in the state, David Trone actually did pretty well in traditionally Republican counties, obviously Western Maryland, where he formerly represented, but also the Eastern Shore as well. But Alsobrooks did well in basically all of the areas of the state that typically vote blue in general elections anyway, and the 2 major metro areas in the state, Baltimore and, of course, D.C. So, Alsobrooks is probably the stronger of the 2 candidates. And, taking a look at the polls that we have for the general election, that sort of backs that up as well, because now Alsobrooks is pulling ahead of Larry Hogan by a margin of around 10 points in the latest poll, according to Emerson. And then a Democratic internal poll had her up by around 9. So, Alsobrooks is in a very good position. Also, when it comes to fundraising, she's raised $7.7 million. Larry Hogan's only raised $3 million. Now, I think Republicans had initially thought that this would be a much closer contest, given the fact that Larry Hogan was a former popular governor who left office with, a 70% plus approval rating. But obviously the fundraising numbers now, Democrats are putting a lot more money into the state, which was always going to happen. And I think the GOP's dream of this sort of being a close contest and Democrats having to divert resources here is probably fading away pretty rapidly because Maryland is fundamentally a very Democratic state. It was the 3rd most Democratic state back in 2020. And Larry Hogan actually winning outright was incredibly, incredibly unlikely. Obviously, I think in the beginning, even in the video I made about a month ago, I thought Larry Hogan would get this race probably within 10 points or so. Now I think we're probably looking at a much larger margin for the Democrat because honestly, at this point, it really just comes down to the fact that American voters are less likely to split ticket, especially when it comes to federal elections. Back in 2020, only 1 state had a different representative of a major party winning the Senate race as opposed to the presidential, and that, of course, was the state of Maine with Susan Collins. Biden carried the state of Maine by 9 points. Susan Collins ended up winning by around 9 points. So it's very, very unlikely in 2024 U.S. politics that you see split ticket voting in presidential contests like this, and especially in a state that is the third most Democratic state in the entire country, even with a popular former governor. I mean, there's been plenty of other examples where you've had governors of the opposite party of the state's typical partisan lean end up running for national office or Senate and end up doing pretty poorly there. We saw that in 2020 with Steve Bullock, who was very popular as Montana governor, ended up running for the Senate in 2020, lost by 10 or 11 points, so he really didn't do that much better than Joe Biden in the state. So obviously, I think Larry Hogan is going to outrun Trump pretty considerably. He's from, I believe, the Annapolis area, and this is a part of the state that traditionally was more Republican leaning, in the past couple decades. Obviously, it's gotten incredibly more Democratic, so this is certainly an area where I think he could do better. But, even if Larry Hogan is winning Anne Arundel County, Frederick County, formerly Republican-leaning counties, that still puts Maryland's overall vote percentage for Republicans under 40%. So, Larry Hogan would have to make massive inroads around the Baltimore suburbs and in the D.C. area, which is sort of Alsobrooks' strength because she's from Prince George's County. This is typically a county where, Republicans like Donald Trump get high single digits. And, back in 2018, Larry Hogan got 28% of the vote here. So I don't think he's going to do nearly as well in this county, mainly because this is now a presidential election. Now, Larry Hogan has been the benefactor of split ticket voting. Larry Hogan ended up outrunning the Republican nominee for Senate by a pretty astronomical margin. You're looking at essentially a 35-point margin for the Democrat in the Senate race. And then, of course, Larry Hogan winning the governor's race by around 12 points. So massively, massively outperforming. But you have to understand that Larry Hogan was incredibly popular, and they were reelecting him for a term as governor, not to represent the state federally, because no Republican has won a Senate race in Maryland since 1980. So you have history against Larry Hogan, obviously the state's partisan lean against Larry Hogan, and of course you have Donald Trump being on the ticket against Larry Hogan. Now, if any Republican other than Donald Trump had won the primary, this would still be a massive uphill climb for Larry Hogan, no doubt. And he's certainly been able to foster some anti-Trump credentials among independents and moderate Democrats in the state, which is one of the reasons why they reelected him pretty overwhelmingly, especially considering the state back in 2018. But I don't think that's going to be enough to get him the Senate seat. Obviously, when voters realize that Larry Hogan is going to caucus with the GOP, he's mostly going to vote with the GOP, even if he's going to be a more moderate to centrist senator. I really think at the end of the day, voters in Maryland are going to choose the Democrat pretty overwhelmingly. So, while Republicans had some hopes early on, especially as the polling had Larry Hogan dominating the field against not just Alsobrooks, but also David Trone, those hopes have faded away pretty rapidly because I think now that the primaries are over, political reality is sort of setting in, and, people are realizing Maryland's fundamentally a Democratic state. I mean, Joe Biden is underwater, nationally speaking, by around 16 points, but in the state of Maryland, he's essentially tied in terms of approval and disapproval, and most of that disapproval is coming from Democrats. We'll look back at the beginning of Biden's term, his disapproval in Maryland was only 30%, his approval was 61%. So, massive decline. Obviously, there's been a number of reasons why that's been the case. His approval went up briefly after the Inflation Reduction Act and the midterm elections, but of course after that it slowly began to decline. And this is really a trend around the country, which is honestly surprising to me that Joe Biden isn't viewed more popularly in Maryland given the state's partisan lean, because I believe there's states that are lighter shades of blue than Maryland where Joe Biden is doing a little bit better. But, nonetheless, Biden's popularity in the state really doesn't matter all that much. I think at the end of the day, Biden's going to carry Maryland overwhelmingly, and I think Brooks is also going to win. Maybe not overwhelmingly, but she's certainly going to win probably by double digits at this point. And, I think Larry Hogan can try maybe to help down ballot Republicans in his effort to run for Senate. But I think at this point in time, especially given the recent polls that we've seen, him winning in Maryland is now more unlikely than it was before in my last video. So this video was really just to provide an update now that the primaries are over, now that we have some new polling data. Republicans' hopes of winning the state of Maryland are pretty diminished. And, this would have been a wild card state had Larry Hogan been in a stronger position, because if Republicans, for whatever reason, lost the state of Montana, lost Ohio, but still flipped West Virginia, if they somehow flipped Maryland, that would give them a straight majority in the Senate, because if West Virginia were to flip, you'd have a 50-50 Senate. Maryland flipping would put Republicans at 51 seats. So now it's very unlikely that Maryland is going to become that 51st seat for the Republicans, but it really was never likely to begin with. So Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.